The letter had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft, the paper thin as old skin at the corners. Wren Aldgate read it one last time as the wagon rolled to a stop, her eyes moving over the unsteady handwriting of a man who had written quickly, or written with hands that shook, or perhaps both. "Come," the letter said, near the end. "There is more here than I can explain in a letter. Come and see for yourself." She folded it along its worn lines and tucked it into the inner pocket of her coat, close to her ribs, where she had kept it for the better part of 3 weeks. The paper was warm from her body. She had carried warmer things for less reason. Then she picked up her bag, stepped down from the wagon without waiting for help, and looked at the land in front of her. It was bigger than she had imagined. That was the first thing. The ranch spread wide in both directions, the kind of land that did not apologize for its size, that simply existed on a scale that made a person feel appropriately small without making them feel unwelcome. The grass moved in a slow current from west to east, the dry stalks catching the afternoon light and holding it in a way that made the whole field seem to breathe. The sky above it was the particular blue of late afternoon, deepening at the edges towards something darker and more honest. Fences ran in long, straight lines toward the horizon and then disappeared into it, as though the land itself had swallowed them. The house sat back from the road, substantial and plain, built by someone who cared more about permanence than impression. 2 stories, with a covered porch running along the entire front. Flower boxes on the lower windows, empty now but recently tended. The soil still dark from watering. The brackets freshly painted. One of the boards near the left post needed replacing. The window on the east side had a crack in the upper corner sealed with something dark and careful. Someone had mended what was broken here, but mending took time, and there was more. Still waiting. Wren noticed these things the way she noticed most things, quietly and without making a production of it. She had spent enough years in rooms where what you noticed and what you said about it were 2 entirely different calculations. She had learned to keep the calculation internal and let the noticing do its work in silence. The man at the colt barn had not looked up when the wagon arrived. He was working a young horse on a lead, moving the animal in a slow circle, his attention entirely on the task. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, built the way men are built when their work is physical and their years are long. His coat was dark with road dust at the hem. His hat was pulled low against the afternoon glare. He handled the horse with the particular economy of someone who had done this 10,000 times and no longer needed to think about it. Which meant he was thinking about something else entirely, and the horse was simply the thing his hands did while his mind went wherever it went. Wren picked up her bag and walked toward him. She crossed the yard without hurrying, picking her way through the uneven ground with the care of someone accustomed to new terrain, taking in details as she went. A row of tools hanging along the barn's outer wall, each one in its proper place. A water trough filled to the correct level, green with the beginning of algae at the edges. Functional, but not recently scrubbed. A cat sitting on the fence post watching her with the elaborate disinterest that cats bring to the arrival of strangers. She stopped a few feet from the man and waited. The horse noticed her first, ears rotating toward her, nostrils widening to take in her scent. The man continued his slow circle for another 3 steps before he looked up. His eyes were gray. Not the soft gray of winter sky, but the harder kind, the gray of stone that has been rained on for a long time. They took her in with a single assessing sweep that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and covered considerably more ground than most people managed in a full conversation. "I'm here about the letter," Wren said. He looked at her. He did not look surprised exactly. He looked like a man confronting a problem he had suspected might arrive and was now working out which variety of problem it was going to be. "What letter?" he said. It was not a question. That was the first thing she understood about Gideon Farrow. She reached into her coat and produced the letter. Held it out without explanation. He took it with one hand, the lead still loose in the other, and read it where he stood. The horse shifted its weight and bumped its nose gently against his shoulder. He did not respond to the horse. The wind moved through the grass beyond the fence. Wren waited with her bag at her feet and her hands at her sides. He read it twice. She could tell because his eyes moved to the top again after the first pass. He was not a man who read things carelessly. Then he looked at the signature at the bottom, and something changed in his face. Not softening, exactly. More like the slight adjustment a person makes when the ground beneath them turns out to be a half-inch lower than expected. Small, controlled, but real. He had recognized the handwriting. She could see that. And whatever the handwriting meant to him, it was something he had been half expecting and had not fully prepared for. "You'd better come inside," he said. He handed the lead to a boy of perhaps 14 who had materialized from the barn's interior with the quiet efficiency of someone trained to be useful and unobtrusive. And then he walked toward the house without checking to see if Wren was following. She followed. The porch steps were solid under her feet. The door was unlocked and opened onto a front hall that smelled of wood smoke and something savory that had been cooking since mid-morning. The kitchen was large and plain and smelled of the stove and beeswax and the faint mineral undertone of the well water. A cast-iron stove occupied the eastern wall, its surface dark and well-seasoned. A long table ran down the center of the room, scarred with the evidence of years of use. Knife marks, water rings, a burn near one end that someone had sanded smooth but not removed. The shelves were orderly. Someone here valued order, or had once. Gideon led her through without ceremony and stopped at the doorway to the front room. "Papa," he said. The old man in the chair by the window had been watching them come across the yard. Wren understood this because his eyes were already on her when she stepped into the room, not startled, not surprised, but alert with the particular alertness of someone who has been waiting and is now taking inventory of what has finally arrived. He looked like a man doing sums in his head, and from the slight easing of his expression, the sums appeared to be coming out approximately correct. He was thin in the way of men whose bodies are spending themselves on something they cannot stop. Not the thinness of neglect, but of ongoing expenditure. The body drawing on reserves it will not replenish. His hands on the arms of the chair were large and knotted. Hands that had worked hard for a long time, now resting with the particular stillness of things that have been set aside. His eyes were dark and clear and missed nothing. His hair was white and still thick, combed with care. Whatever he was, he had not stopped attending to himself. "You came," he said. His voice was steadier than she expected. "I wasn't sure you would." "Your letter was persuasive," Wren said. A faint smile moved across his face. It was a good smile, genuine and slightly wry, the smile of a man who knows he has done something questionable and is not entirely sorry about it. "It was honest," he said. "That's not always the same thing as persuasive, but sometimes they worked together. He looked at her for a moment with an attention that was not rude, but was entirely unambiguous. He was deciding something, and he was not pretending otherwise. Whatever he decided seemed to satisfy him, because his shoulders eased slightly, and he made a small gesture toward the chair across from him. "Sit down, please. You've had a long ride." Gideon was still standing in the doorway. Wren sat in the chair across from the old man and did not look back at him, though she was aware of him in the particular way you are aware of weather when it has not yet decided what it intends to do. A presence that could move in any direction, carrying with it the capacity for sun or storm. "Mr. Farrow," she said to the old man. "Elias," he said. "I'm too old for Mr. Farrow. That was my father's name, and he's been gone 40 years, and I don't see why I should keep answering to it." "Elias, you signed the letter with your son's name." The old man held her gaze without flinching. "I did. He didn't write it." "No." From the doorway, Gideon said nothing. The silence from that direction had a weight to it, the specific gravity of a man exercising significant restraint. "I'd like to understand why," Wren said. Elias looked at his hands for a moment, the hands of a man who had built things and repaired things, and worked this land for the better part of his life, now folded in his lap like tools put away at the end of a long day. Then he looked back at her with the directness of someone who is past the age at which evasion seems worth the effort. "Because if I had signed it with my own name," he said, "you would have written back asking what business it was of mine. And you would have been right to ask, and I would have had to answer, and whatever answer I gave you would have sounded exactly like what it was. An old man interfering in his grown son's life because he's frightened of what will happen when he can no longer do so." He paused. "And then we would not be having this conversation." Another pause, shorter. "I needed you to come before you could decide not to." Wren looked at him for a long moment. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Somewhere outside, the young horse moved in the corral, hooves on packed earth, the rhythm of something being settled. A clock somewhere in the house marked the seconds. "That is either very wise," she said, "or very presumptuous." "In my experience," Elias said, "those two things are almost always the same thing at the time. You only find out which one it was later." Another pause, shorter. "I am sorry for the deception. I mean that. It was not my first choice, and if I had been able to think of a better one, I would have used it." She believed him. That was the strange thing. She had spent enough of her life in the company of apologies that did not mean anything to recognize one that did. There was a particular quality to a genuine apology, something in the way the words sat in the air, neither reaching for absolution nor deflecting consequence. His words had that quality. He was sorry, and he had done it anyway, and he was not asking her to resolve the contradiction for him. Behind her, Gideon moved. She heard his boots on the floor, heard him pull out a chair, heard him sit. Not at the table, but against the far wall, far enough to be separate from the conversation while remaining in it, present, but not participant. She wondered if this was habitual, positioning himself at the edge of things, or if it was specific to this particular situation. She suspected it was both. "You can stay tonight," Gideon said. His voice was even and without inflection. "There's a room. In the morning, if you want to go back, I'll arrange the wagon." He said it without hostility. That was the second thing she understood about him. He was not unkind. He was simply operating at a careful distance from everything, and he had been doing it long enough that the distance felt natural to him, the way a limp becomes natural after years, not chosen, but habitual, and therefore almost invisible to the person who carries it. Wren looked at him. He met her eyes once, briefly, with the gray directness she was beginning to understand was simply how he saw things. Straight on, without softening. And then looked at the window, where the afternoon light was beginning to change toward evening. "Thank you," she said. Elias showed her to the room himself, moving slowly down the hall with the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned to husband his energy. Not shuffling, not fragile, but considered. Each step placed with intent, the body conserving what it had. He carried a lamp, even though the hall was still light enough to navigate, which told her the lamp was for her benefit rather than his. The room was small and clean, tucked at the end of the hall where the house caught the morning sun. A quilt on the bed in a pattern of blues and creams, faded to the soft tones of something washed many times and loved for it. A pitcher and basin on the stand by the window, the water fresh. A hook on the back of the door for her coat. A small braided rug on the floor in colors that had once been brighter. It was Gideon's room when he was a boy, Elias said, stopping in the doorway. He moved to the larger room when he married. A pause that had texture to it, a weight that was not quite grief and not quite something else, but sat somewhere between the two. He's never moved back. Wren set her bag on the floor beside the bed and looked at the old man in the doorway. How long ago did he lose her? 5 years. The old man's voice did not change. It was the voice of a man who has said a thing so many times that the saying of it has become separate from the feeling of it. A distance he has learned to maintain not from coldness, but from necessity. Clara. She and the child both. He was in the south pasture when it happened. Somebody had to ride out to tell him. He was quiet for a moment, looking at something in the middle distance that was not in the room. He hasn't gone back to the south pasture since. The information settled in the room around them like dust after a disturbance, slowly and then all at once, and then simply present, part of the atmosphere of the place. And you think, Wren said carefully, that a stranger arriving in answer to a letter he didn't write is the solution to that. I think, he said, that my son has been solving his own problems alone for 5 years, and has gotten worse at all of them. He pulled the door halfway closed, then paused. There's coffee in the morning at first light. He's up before that, but the coffee is at first light. His eyes found hers one more time, and in them she saw the thing she had heard in his letter. The urgency under the patience, the running clock underneath the careful words. I'm glad you came, Wren. Sleep well. She heard his slow steps recede down the hall, measured and deliberate. She stood in the center of the small room for a moment, hands at her sides, looking at nothing in particular, letting the day settle into her bones the way a long journey always had to settle before you could feel the ground under you again. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both palms flat against the quilt and felt the steadiness of the mattress beneath her. She had left with one bag and a letter signed with a stranger's name. She had told herself she was going because the letter had described land and work, and a situation that required someone practical, and practical was what she was. She had told herself it was a reasonable decision, made by a woman who was done letting other people arrange her life into shapes she had not chosen. She had told herself many things on the wagon, watching the land change from settled to open, from road to range, from the familiar to the kind of vast that required a different way of breathing. What she had not told herself, what she was only beginning to admit in the quiet of this small room in a house she did not know, with the sounds of the ranch settling into its evening rhythms around her, was that there had been a single line near the end of Elias Pharaoh's letter that had undone all her careful reasoning and replaced it with something simpler and more difficult to name. "My son doesn't know he's lonely," the letter had said. "That's the worst kind." She had read it and felt something move in her chest, quick and quiet, like a bird startling from a branch. Because she had known that kind of loneliness. She had lived inside it for years without knowing what to call it, had called it independence, had called it self-sufficiency, had dressed it up in reasonable language, and carried it around like a virtue, until the morning she found the correspondence between her former fiancé and the man who had arranged their first meeting, and understood with a cold and perfect clarity that she had been managed for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to simply want something for herself, not to be chosen according to someone else's plan, not to be placed where she would be useful, not to be the solution to someone else's problem without being asked if she wanted to be, just to want, to decide, to walk towards something because she had looked at it and decided it was worth walking toward. She lay back on the quilt without removing her boots and looked at the ceiling, at the plaster that had a small crack running from the corner toward the window, carefully and imperfectly mended in a way that suggested someone had tried and known they had not quite succeeded, but had done their best with what they had. She was here for 1 month. That was what she had decided on the wagon. 1 month. And she would work. And she would decide with clear eyes and no obligation in either direction. She was not here to save anyone. She was not here to be saved. She was here because for the first time in as long as she could remember, the decision had been entirely hers, even if the letter that prompted it had been signed with the wrong name. She set the lamp on the table by the bed and let the room go dark around its small warm circle, and she listened to the sounds of the house settling, the tick of cooling wood, the murmur of wind in the eaves, the distant and occasional sound of an animal in the dark of the yard. And she thought about the crack in the ceiling, mended imperfectly but with care, and she fell asleep, still thinking about it, which surprised her in the morning when she remembered. In the morning, she woke before the coffee was ready, and lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the ranch coming to life. Boots on floorboards somewhere in the depths of the house, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who has been awake for some time already and has learned to move without disturbing the rest of the household. The low sound of an animal outside, patient and rhythmic. The particular sound of a well-cared-for horse moving in a familiar space. Wind in the eaves, which had a different voice than the wind she had grown up with. Slower, more considered, as though it had traveled a long way to get here, and was not in a hurry to leave. She dressed and went to the kitchen and found it empty, the fire already built in the stove and beginning to catch properly. The kindling had been placed with care, the larger pieces arranged to catch in sequence. Someone had been here before her, and had left the kitchen prepared without making a production of the preparation. She put the coffee on herself, and stood at the window and watched the early light come across the grass in long horizontal bars, gold at the edges and silver at the center where the dew still held. She thought about the crease in the porch board she had noticed on the way in. She thought about the crack in the window sealed with careful dark compound. She thought about the way Gideon Farrow had looked at his father's signature at the bottom of a letter written in his own name, not surprised, only tired, in the specific way of someone who loves a person and has long since stopped being astonished by them, and who carries that particular love with the patience of someone who has accepted that it will always cost something. When Gideon came in from the yard and found her at the stove, he stopped in the doorway for exactly 1 second, long enough to register what he was seeing, not long enough to make something of it. He came in and sat at the table with the economy of motion she was beginning to recognize as characteristic, nothing wasted, nothing performed. "Coffee's almost ready," she said without turning around. He came in and sat at the table. She heard the chair, heard him set something down. His hat, from the sound of it, placed on the table beside him rather than hung on the hook by the door. When she brought the 2 cups and set one in front of him, he looked at it, then at her, then at the window, where the light was still coming in, low and long, across the yard. "You're still here," he said. "I said I'd stay a month." She sat across from him with her cup. "It's been less than 12 hours. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite humor, but the memory of it. The place where humor had once lived and might, under different circumstances, be persuaded to visit again. The lines at the corners of his eyes deepened slightly in a way that was not a smile, but was related to smiling. He drank his coffee and did not say anything else, and Wren drank hers and did the same. The fire in the stove settled into its working rhythm. Outside, the morning gathered itself together, the light strengthening and the sounds of the ranch multiplying, the distant voices of the hands beginning their work, the movement of animals, the ordinary music of a working place waking up. When he stood to go, he paused at the door, his hat in his hand, and looked at the wall beside the door rather than at her. "There's a section of the kitchen garden that needs clearing," he said. "The east row, if you're going to be working." He said the last part with a slight inflection that might have been question or might have been statement. She chose to hear it as statement. "I'll find it," she said. He left. The door closed behind him with the sound of a man who has learned to close things carefully, not loudly, not softly, but precisely, with exactly the force required and no more. Wren sat with her cup for a moment longer, listening to his boots cross the porch and descend the steps and move away across the yard. Then she got up, put on her coat, and went to find the kitchen garden. She had been working in it for perhaps half an hour, making more mistakes than not, learning the difference between what needed to come out and what needed to stay. Discovering that the soil here was different from the soil she had grown up with, darker and more resistant. When she heard Elias's slow step on the porch, he lowered himself into the chair at the porch's edge. Not the chair by the window inside. This was a different one, older, its wood darkened with years of weather and use, set at an angle that caught the morning sun and sheltered it from the prevailing wind. He arranged himself in it with the deliberateness of a man for whom sitting has become an activity requiring its full attention, and then he watched her work with the unhurried attention of someone with no particular place to be. "You're doing it wrong," he said pleasantly. Wren looked up from the row she was clearing. "I know. I'm figuring it out." He smiled at that. It was a good smile, the kind that had lines around it from long use, the kind that has earned its depth. You're not from ranch country. No. But you're not afraid of the work. No. He was quiet for a moment, watching her hands in the soil. Gideon didn't say much this morning. Not a question. He said there was garden work. She pulled a long-rooted weed with the particular satisfaction of feeling the whole root give. That seemed like enough. He talked more than that once, the old man said. Before. The word hung in the morning air with a particular weight. He was a man who noticed everything and kept it, remembered details other people forgot before they'd finished hearing them. Came home for supper, came home in general, meaning not just to the house, but to the room he was standing in. He was present. Whatever he was doing it fully. A pause. After Clara, he just got quieter and quieter. And after a while, the quiet became the whole of him. And I think somewhere in those 5 years, he forgot there was ever anything else. Wren sat back on her heels and looked at the old man in his chair in the morning sun. His color was not good, not dramatically wrong, not the color of someone in crisis, but the color of someone whose resources are being slowly called in, the particular pallor of a body that is directing its energy elsewhere. His breathing had the slightly effortful quality of a machine working harder than its design intended to perform functions that should be simple. She had noticed it the evening before, and noted it again now. "Elias," she said, "why did you really send for me?" "I told you last night." "You told me part of it." She held his gaze. "You told me your son needs someone. That's true, probably. But men in a difficult straits usually find their way eventually, or they don't. And either way, they do it without their fathers writing letters in their names to women in distant places." She tilted her head slightly. "Why now?" The old man looked at her for a long moment. The sun moved a fraction in the sky. A bird called from somewhere in the line of trees to the east, once, and then was quiet, as though it had said what it came to say. "Because I'm running out of time to wait for eventually," Elias said. He said it simply and without self-pity, which was more honest than most of the things anyone had ever said to her. Self-pity would have made it smaller. The absence of it made it something else entirely. A plain statement of fact, offered without request for comfort, simply placed between them as a thing that was true. Wren looked at him and understood. Not everything, not yet, but the shape of it. The urgency underneath the patience of the letter. The handwriting that had been slightly unsteady, not from age, but from something more immediate and harder to manage. She turned back to the garden without another word and pulled the next weed and the next. And the old man sat in his chair in the morning sun and watched her work, and neither of them spoke again for a long time. And the silence between them was the particular kind that grows up between two people who have understood something important about each other and do not need to belabor it. That evening, after supper, a meal that Wren had helped prepare, and that had been eaten in the kitchen with a quiet efficiency that suggested this was how meals had been taken here for a long time, necessary and without ceremony. After Elias had gone down the hall with the careful step of a man preserving his energy, after Gideon had gone out to make his final check of the animals, Wren cleared the table and set the lamp on the counter and opened the drawer beneath it to look for a cloth. What she found instead was a stack of letters. They were tied loosely with a piece of cord gone soft from being handled many times, she thought, over a long period. The handwriting on the top envelope was the same unsteady hand she recognized from the letter in her coat pocket. But this handwriting was older, more formed, as though the unsteadiness was recent, and the hand beneath it had once been very precise. She stood with the cloth forgotten in her other hand and looked at the top envelope. And then, because she was the kind of person who believed that some things are not accidental, that some things are left where they can be found, because the person who left them needed them to be found, she looked at the name written there. It was not a name she recognized, a woman's name written with the particular care of someone addressing something precious, something that mattered more than the effort of good penmanship. Written with the kind of care that means the person writing it is trying, through the act of forming the letters, to honor something they cannot otherwise reach. She did not open the letters. She stood with them in her hands for a moment, feeling the weight of them, not paper weight, but the other kind, the kind that accumulates when a person writes the same things to the same silence for a long time. Then she put them back in the drawer exactly as she had found them, closed it gently, and found the cloth on the shelf above. Outside, she could hear Gideon's boots on the porch steps, returning. She dried the dishes and did not say anything about the drawer, and he came in and poured himself the last of the coffee and stood at the counter without quite looking at her. And the lamp made a warm circle that included them both without either of them having arranged it that way. A small, accidental intimacy of light and warmth that neither acknowledged and neither moved to disturb. "You don't have to stay," he said. He was looking at his cup. "I want you to know that. Whatever he wrote, whatever he told you, you don't have to stay." Wren set the last dish on the shelf and folded the cloth over the counter's edge with the neatness of long habit. "I know," she said. She picked up her own lamp from the table. "Good night, Gideon." She walked down the hall to the small room, and she closed the door quietly behind her, and she sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her, the wind in the eaves, the fire in the stove burning low, the distant and occasional sound of an animal in the dark of the yard, patient in its space. She thought about what Elias had said, running out of time. She thought about the letters in the drawer, addressed in that careful handwriting to someone who could not answer. She thought about the south pasture, wherever it was, and what it meant that a man had not returned to a piece of his own land for 5 years. She thought about her own life and the engagement she had left, and the careful way she had been managed into it without ever being asked what she wanted. She thought about the morning she had read those letters and felt the floor go out from under the past 4 years, and how she had sat very still for a long time afterward, not from shock, but from the particular stillness of a person recalculating from the beginning. She did not know if she was going to stay beyond the month she had promised. What she knew was this: she had read that letter 20 times and traveled a long distance in answer to it, and the thing that had brought her was not the promise of land or work or practical arrangement. It was a single sentence written by an old man about his son. He doesn't know he's lonely. That's the worst kind. And the reason she had kept reading that sentence was not pity. It was recognition. The same way you recognize sometimes a face across a distance, not because you know who they are, but because something in the angle of them is familiar to something in you. She set the lamp on the table by the bed and lay back on the quilt. Tomorrow, she thought, she would figure out how to clear the garden row without pulling the wrong things. She would ask Elias about the soil. She would learn the names of the ranch hands and the horses and the particular geography of this place that she did not yet know how to read. 1 month. That was all she had agreed to. But she fell asleep to the sound of the wind in the eaves and did not think about leaving. The axe was heavier than it looked. That was the first thing Wren had learned about ranch work. Everything was heavier than it looked, and the weight was not the obstacle so much as learning where to put it, how to let the tool do what it was designed to do instead of fighting it with effort that went nowhere useful. She had been watching Gideon split wood for 3 mornings before she tried it herself. He did it the way he did most things, economically, without wasted motion, the axe rising and falling with a rhythm that was almost meditative. She had stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched and tried to understand the mechanics of it. The way the split happened, not from force applied downward, but from something more precise. A reading of the grain, a placement that let the wood give way along its own natural lines. The axe was not breaking the wood so much as finding where the wood already wanted to break. On the 4th morning, she went out before he was done and picked up the secondary axe that leaned against the far end of the chopping block, lighter than his, meant for smaller work, and positioned a log and swung. The axe glanced off the side and buried itself in the dirt. She pulled it out, brushed the blade clean, repositioned the log, and swung again. Better this time, but the split was uneven. One piece considerably thicker than the other. The grain read wrong. She was working on the 3rd log when she became aware that Gideon had stopped his own work. She did not look up. She studied the log in front of her, trying to see what she had seen him see. The line where the grain ran, the place that would give cleanest. She adjusted her grip and brought the axe down. Still wrong. Too far left. Then his hand came over her shoulder, not touching her, not correcting her by force, just positioning, a presence above her own hands, adjusting the angle of the handle by perhaps 10 degrees. A small thing. He stepped back immediately, said nothing. She tried again. The logs split clean down the center, both halves falling away from each other with a sound like a small, satisfied exhale. She stood with the axe and looked at the 2 even pieces, and felt something settle in her chest that was not pride exactly, but was adjacent to it. The particular satisfaction of a body learning something true, the feeling of a skill beginning to take root. When she turned, he was already walking back to his own block. He did not look back, but she noticed that he did not move out of earshot either, and she went on splitting wood in the early morning and made only 2 more bad strikes for every good one, which she considered adequate progress for a 4th day. She found her rhythm with the work by the end of the 1st week, which surprised her less than it surprised the ranch hands. Duff and Orrin, mid-40s and mid-50s respectively, the first compact and quick-moving, the second large and deliberate, had clearly expected her to last 3 days at the outside. They had treated her with the careful neutrality of men who have been wrong about people before and have learned to wait before deciding. By the 5th day, Duff was leaving the coffee pot on the stove for her without being asked, a small adjustment to the morning routine that cost him nothing and told her something. By the 7th, Orrin tipped his hat when she came into the yard. Not a large gesture, but a considered one. Small things. But she had always believed that small things were where the real information lived. The kitchen garden came along steadily. She learned which rows were meant for what. mostly by asking Elias, who would sit in his chair on the porch in the mornings and answer her questions with the pleased attention of someone whose knowledge has been asked for. He knew this land the way old people know things they have tended, not as information but as relationship, a conversation conducted over decades. He told her which side of the fence caught the most wind and why the beans needed the eastern wall for their best growth, and what the color of the soil near the water line told you about drainage. He told her these things with the generosity of someone sharing something they love, and she listened and remembered without writing it down, which seemed to please him. Some things she figured out herself, the rhythm of the place, the particular sequence of tasks that kept the household functional, the hour at which the hands came in for water and what they preferred to drink it from, the way the horses communicated their mood through the angle of their ears and the quality of their stillness, the different sounds the wind made through different sections of the fence, depending on the tension of the wire and the dryness of the posts, so that you could hear from inside the kitchen whether the east fence needed checking. She was learning the language of the ranch the way she had always learned languages, through attention and patience, and the willingness to be wrong many times before being right. The children arrived on what she believed was a Tuesday. Ranch days had a way of losing their names while keeping their character, so that you knew it was a working day or a mending day or a supply day without necessarily knowing what the calendar said it was. There were two of them, a girl of about 9 and a boy perhaps 6, belonging to a family that ran a smaller operation 1.5 miles to the east. They appeared at the gate in the morning, with the slightly guilty look of children who have been told that the new arrival at the Faro place is not their business and have decided to investigate anyway, balancing the certainty of being scolded against the greater urgency of needing to know. Wren was mending a section of fence near the gate when they arrived. She looked at them and they looked at her. "We heard there was a new lady," the girl said. "That seems to be correct," Wren said. The boy was watching her with enormous, solemn eyes. "Can you read?" the girl asked. "I can. Our mother can't. She knows some words, but not all of them. She's teaching us what she knows, but she says she might be teaching us wrong things, and she's worried about that." Wren set down her mending tools and looked at the two children for a moment. The boy had a smudge of something, mud or axle grease, or both, on his left cheek, and was watching her with the enormous, careful eyes of a child who has not yet learned to disguise his curiosity. "What's your name?" she asked the girl. "Petra. This is my brother Lev." "Well, Petra, Lev, if your mother agrees, come back tomorrow morning with whatever books or papers you have, and we'll see what we can do." Petra's expression went through several stages rapidly: surprise, calculation, satisfaction, before settling on something very close to dignity. "All right," she said, as though this had been her idea. She took her brother by the hand and led him back down the road with the purposeful stride of someone who has accomplished what they came to do. Wren finished mending the fence and went back to the yard and found Gideon loading feed in the barn. She told him about the children, not asking permission, simply informing him of what she intended. He listened without looking up from what he was doing. "Rennick family," he said. "Good people. Hard year for them. I thought I'd teach the children in the mornings, an hour or so." He picked up another sack. "That's your time to do with as you choose." She stood in the barn door for a moment. "You're not going to object." He set the sack down and finally looked at her, just briefly. Why would I object? She did not have an answer to that, which she supposed was answer enough. Petra and Lev came the next morning with a Bible, a seed catalog that had been read so many times its spine was broken, and a piece of paper that had been used to practice letters in a hand that was uncertain but earnest. Wren sat with them at the kitchen table for an hour and discovered that Petra was quick in the way of children who have been paying attention to everything around them and simply needed permission to use what they had gathered, and that Lev learned better if she let him trace the letters with his finger before trying to write them himself. The connection between hand and mark being more important, for him, than the mark on its own. She taught them every morning after that. Some mornings Elias would come to the kitchen doorway and watch for a while, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, saying nothing. He had an expression she was coming to recognize, a kind of quiet satisfaction that was also tinged with something more complicated, something that had to do with time running out and things still left to see. The expression of a man who is taking inventory of the good things around him with the particular attention of someone who knows the inventory will not be kept much longer. Gideon noticed the lessons. She knew he noticed because of the coffee, and then because of the lamp. On the third morning of the lessons, she came to the kitchen early to find a second lamp already lit on the table, placed exactly where the light would fall most usefully across the work, in the position she had been meaning to move one of the existing lamps to but hadn't yet gotten around to. He was gone before she could say anything, boots already on the porch, moving toward the barn. She stood in the kitchen, looking at the lamp, and understood that this was his language, and she was beginning to learn to read it. He did not say, "I see what you are doing." He did not say, "This seems like a good thing." He said nothing. He moved a lamp. Cobb Reeve came on a Thursday afternoon, riding in from the East Road with the unhurried manner of a man making a social call that is only incidentally official. He was younger than Gideon by several years, with an open face and the kind of ease in his own skin that comes from having made peace with who you are at a relatively early age. Not smugness, but settledness. The quality of a man who does not have to work very hard to inhabit himself. He wore a deputy's badge without the self-consciousness of a man who needs the authority it represents, which Wren took as a reasonable indication of his character. He introduced himself at the gate, hat in hand, with the directness of someone who does not see the point of indirect approaches when direct ones work just as well and take less time. I'd heard Elias finally convinced someone to come out. Wanted to stop in and make sure everything was settling all right. Wren offered him coffee, which he accepted without ceremony. They sat on the porch because the afternoon was mild, and Elias was inside resting, and Gideon was in the east pasture, and would not be back for another 2 hours. "How are you finding it?" he asked. Genuinely, she thought, not as a social lubricant. Harder than I expected. Better than I expected. Both things are true at the same time, which I find is usually what the truth looks like. He nodded at that. That's about right for this place. He turned his cup in his hands. Gideon, treating you all right? He's treating me the way he treats everything. Carefully. From a distance. Cobb smiled at that. A real smile, the kind that involves the eyes as much as the mouth. That's accurate. He paused, looking at the range. He wasn't always like that, you know. Before Clara, he was someone you could call on for anything, and he'd show up before you'd finished asking. Remembered what everyone around him was carrying. Their good days, their troubles, their children's names, The things they'd mentioned in passing 6 months ago. He came home for supper, and he was actually present at supper, not just there in body. He glanced at her. He still notices things. He's just stopped letting on that he does. Wren thought about the lamp on the teaching table, placed exactly where the light would be useful. She thought about the axe angle, corrected without a word. "You knew them both," she said. "Him and Clara. Grew up in the same territory. Known Gideon most of my life." Another pause. He blamed himself. After. A man who blames himself for something he couldn't have changed is a man who needs to be very busy so he doesn't have to think. That's what the last 5 years have been. He looked at her. "You're different than I expected. Elias described you as practical. That undersells it." Practical is accurate. Maybe, but practical people don't usually travel 600 miles and answer to a letter signed with the wrong name. She met his eyes. Practical people know when something is worth the inconvenience. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he nodded once, slowly, with the air of a man filing something away for later consideration. He finished his coffee and stood and put his hat back on and said goodbye the way he'd arrived, directly, without fuss, and rode back out the east road. Wren sat on the porch with the 2 empty cups and thought about all the small adjustments a person makes when they have decided they no longer have a right to want things openly, when wanting something has become too connected to the possibility of losing it to be worth the risk. The night of the foaling came 3 weeks into her stay, without warning, the way these things tend to arrive. She woke to the sound of movement in the yard, not alarm, not chaos, but urgency. The particular quality of someone moving fast in the dark with a clear and immediate purpose. She dressed quickly and went out and found Gideon already in the foaling stall with the mare, his coat still half on. The lamp hung on the post above him, throwing gold light across the straw and the heaving sides of the animal. She did not ask if he needed help. She came in and took a position on the other side of the mare and waited to be useful, watching what he was doing and doing what she could read was needed without being told. They worked for 3 hours. The work was not dramatic, but it was hard. The mare in distress, the foal presenting badly, Gideon guiding and correcting and coaxing with his hands and his voice, which was lower and steadier in the barn than she had heard it in the house, the voice of a man talking an animal through something frightening, calm and constant and authoritative in a way that required complete conviction because the animal could feel the difference. The foal came in the dark hours before dawn, all legs and confusion and determination, and lay in the straw while its mother attended to it, and the lamp swayed slightly in a draft from the barn's upper ventilation and threw moving shadows across the scene that made it look like something remembered rather than something happening. Gideon sat down on the straw against the wall of the stall. He had the look of someone who has spent everything they have on a task and found that it was enough, barely, and is now reckoning with the particular exhaustion that comes after a thing has been gotten through rather than done well. His hat was off. His hair was pressed flat on one side and disordered on the other. There was straw on his coat and something dark on his right cuff that he had not noticed. Wren sat down across from him, her back against the opposite wall, and stretched her legs out in the straw. The foal made a small sound. The mare answered it. The lamp burned steady. Neither of them spoke. She did not know how long they sat there. Long enough for her to feel the exhaustion settle into her own shoulders, the specific and satisfying weight of work that demanded everything and then released you all at once. long enough for the quality of the dark outside to begin its subtle shift towards something that was not yet light, but was no longer entirely dark. At some point, she noticed that the tension in Gideon's shoulders had changed. He was not relaxed. She was not sure relaxed was something he permitted himself, or had permitted himself in a long time. But the particular held quality of him had eased. The bracing against whatever he perpetually expected had loosened somewhat, and he was simply sitting in the straw with a new foal and the smell of hay and lantern oil and the warmth of the mare and the company of another person who had stayed through the difficult part. She thought, "This is the first time he has not seemed like a man waiting for something to leave." She did not say this. She looked at the foal's improbably delicate legs, the wet curl of its mane, the way it was already testing the question of standing, and she let the silence be what it was. Not empty, but full. A different kind of full than most silences she had sat inside. The morning after the foaling, Elias called her into his room before breakfast. The room was small and simply furnished, the window facing east to catch the morning light. He was sitting up in bed with a quilt across his legs and something on his lap that he was turning over in his hands as she came in. He held out the object, a small wooden box, the kind made for keeping rather than for showing, plain-sided, dark wood, worn smooth at the edges and the corners from years of handling, the latch a simple polished hook. She crossed the room and took it. "Open it," he said. Inside, on a piece of folded cloth, the color of old cream, was a ring. Plain gold, slightly worn at the inner surface, sized for a hand larger than Wren's. A woman with strong hands, accustomed to work, the kind of hands that hold things and also release them. She looked at it for a moment without touching it. "Clara's," Elias said. She looked up at him. "He put it away the week after she died," the old man said. "Won't look at it, won't speak of it. But he hasn't gotten rid of it either, which means something to me, though I couldn't tell you exactly what." He held her gaze. "I want you to keep it. Not to wear, not for anything like that. Just, I've been keeping it for him. And I'm not going to be keeping things much longer. I don't want it to go back in the dark when I'm gone. It belongs somewhere that someone will remember what it means." Wren looked down at the ring in its folded cloth. She thought about the letters in the kitchen drawer, addressed in careful handwriting to someone who could not answer. She thought about an old man writing the same things to the same silence for years, trying to explain himself to people he had failed to say the right things to when they could still hear him. She thought about what it costs a person to keep things in the dark long enough that they forget there was ever another option. "I'll keep it safe," she said. Elias settled back against his pillows with the slight exhale of someone who has completed something they were not sure they had the strength for. "Good. That's good." He closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in the way of someone resting between efforts, marshaling what they have for what comes next. "Send him in when you go. Tell him I want to play cards." She went back through the house and out to the yard where Gideon was adjusting something in the tack room. She stopped in the doorway. "Your father wants to play cards." He looked up. Something moved in his face, brief and complex and real, the kind of expression that comes from feeling several things at once and not having a clean way to hold them all. He always wants to play cards when he's tired. It's the one game he can win sitting down. He set down what he was working on. "Did he give you something?" She made his eyes. A box to keep for him. He held her gaze for a moment, long enough that she had the distinct sense he knew exactly what was in the box, long enough that she understood this was not news to him, and that whatever he felt about it was something he had already turned over privately many times and was not going to examine again in the open. "All right," he said, and went inside. That evening, after the cards had been played, Elias had won 2 out of 3, with the satisfied expression of a man conducting his day exactly as intended. And after Elias had gone to bed, Wren was washing the dishes when she became aware that Gideon had not gone back out. He was sitting at the table with his coffee, not reading, not working on anything, not even exactly resting, just sitting, which was something she had not seen him do before. He was usually in motion, moving through the ranch with the constant purpose of someone who keeps busy, because the alternative is not something he has worked out what to do with. "He's been giving things away," he said after a while. She did not say she knew. She waited. "Started a few months ago. Little things first. His father's watch to Duff, who'd always admired it. His mother's sewing basket to a woman in town. The stories he knows about every fence post on this place, who put it in and when and why. And now the box." He turned the cup in his hands. "He thinks he's being subtle. He's not trying to be subtle. He's trying to make sure things end up where they belong before he can't choose anymore." "How long did you know?" "I had a sense of it when I arrived. The letter, the handwriting." She held his gaze. "How long have you known?" A long pause. "Since the spring. The doctor came out. Papa didn't tell me what he said, but I know how a doctor carries himself when there's something to be done, and how he carries himself when there isn't. That particular stillness." He looked back at his cup. "He doesn't know I know. He's trying to protect me from it. And you're letting him." He said nothing, which was the same as yes. Wren looked at this man across the table, this large, quiet, carefully contained man who had been carrying the knowledge of his father's dying alone for months, the same way he had carried everything else, in the part of himself he had walled off, and told himself was just how he was now. And she felt something move in her chest that was not pity, and was not admiration, and was not the beginning of love, or at least she could not yet call it that, but was something in the territory of all three, something that had no clean name and did not need one. "He should know that you know," she said quietly. "I know he should." Then, "I know." His voice was not sharp, just final. The voice of a man who has thought about something until thinking about it further serves no purpose. He stood and picked up his cup. "Good night, Wren." She listened to his boots down the hall and the quiet close of his door, and she sat at the table in the lamplight and turned the small wooden box over in her hands once, and then set it in her coat pocket where she would know where it was. Outside, the wind had come up. It moved through the grass in the dark with the sound of something that has traveled a long distance and is not finished yet. Somewhere in the barn, the new foal made a small sound. The mare answered. Wren sat for a while longer in the kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and the particular mineral warmth of a house that has been lived in for a long time, by people who worked hard and said too little and loved in their way, as well as they knew how. Then she put out the lamp and went to bed and lay in the dark, listening to the wind and thinking about two men protecting each other from the same truth, and a box of letters in a kitchen drawer, and what it costs a person to keep things in the dark long enough that they forget there was ever another option. Elias called them both in on a Tuesday afternoon when the light through the front window had gone the color of weak tea and the wind outside had settled into the kind of stillness that comes before a change in weather. Not calm, but suspension. The held breath of a landscape waiting to see what the evening would bring. He was in his chair, as he almost always was now, the quilt across his legs despite the relative warmth of the room. He had asked Duff to bring an extra chair from the kitchen, which meant he had been planning this, which meant he had thought about it long enough to decide it could not wait any longer. The extra chair was positioned where both Wren and Gideon could sit and still see him clearly. He had thought about the geometry of the room. He had thought about all of it. Wren sat in the kitchen chair. Gideon stood near the door with his arms at his sides, which was how he stood when he was preparing for something. Not braced, not defensive, but ready. The posture of a man who has learned that things come, and that it is better to be standing when they do. Elias looked at them both for a moment without speaking. The fire made its small domestic sounds. Outside, a bird called once and did not repeat itself, as though it had said what it came to say and had nothing to add. "I owe you both the truth," Elias said. "I've been owing it for a while, and I've been telling myself I was waiting for the right moment, which is what people tell themselves when they're afraid of the wrong one." He looked at his hands on the quilt. The large, knotted hands of a man whose life had been work, now resting because there was nothing else for them to do. There is no right moment for this kind of thing. There's only doing it and getting it done. He told them everything, not in the careful, measured way of a man who has rehearsed, though he had clearly thought about the telling, but in the direct way of someone who has finally put down something heavy and is simply letting it fall where it falls, with all the mess that entails. The letter, written in Gideon's name. The inquiry he had made. The address obtained through a correspondence that had taken time and required some ingenuity. His reasons, such as they were, and he was careful to say they were not managing, not arranging, only asking in the only way he had been able to think of that might actually work. Because asking Gideon directly, he said, would have produced a conversation that ended with a closed door and another 5 years of the same silence, and he was out of time for another 5 years. He said this last part plainly, without self-pity, and without asking for anything in return for it. It landed in the room with the particular weight of a truth that does not require embellishment. The room was very quiet when he finished. Gideon stood near the door. He had not moved during the telling. His expression had not changed in any way Wren could clearly identify, which she had come to understand meant he was feeling something considerable and had routed it somewhere internal where it would not show until he had decided what to do with it. His hands, though, had gone still at his sides in the specific stillness of controlled effort, not clenched, not tense, but precisely held. He looked at his father for a long moment. Then he looked at Wren. Then he looked at neither of them, and walked out through the kitchen and out the back door, and they heard his boots on the steps, steady and even, and then the sound of them crossing the yard, and then nothing. Elias let out a slow breath. He did not look devastated exactly. He looked like a man who has done what he came to do and is now waiting to find out what it cost. Accepting that there is always a cost, and that accepting it is different from not minding it. "Are you angry?" he asked Wren. "Not at you," she said. He understood what she meant, that the absence of anger at him was not the absence of anger, only its redirection. The ghost of something moved across his face. He'll come back. He always walks it out. It's what he does with things he doesn't know how to hold yet. How long does it usually take? Elias considered. Depends on the size of the thing. This one might be a while. It was full dark before Gideon came back in. Wren had stayed in the kitchen after Elias went to bed, not waiting exactly. She had mended 2 of Elias's shirts with the focused attention of someone who finds that the combination of useful work and silence is the best way to think through something difficult. But she had not gone to her room either. The lamp was low on the table when she heard his boots on the back steps. He came in and stopped when he saw her still there. She did not look up from the shirt she was finishing, giving him the option of the counter or the table without making it a choice he had to declare. He went to the stove and poured the coffee that had been sitting since supper, which would be undrinkable by now, thick and bitter and completely wrong, and drank it anyway, standing at the counter with his back half to her. She finished the seam she was on and set the shirt aside and folded her hands on the table and waited. Did you know when you came? I knew the letter wasn't written by you. The handwriting made that clear. It was old and unsteady in a way that was recent rather than habitual. She paused. I didn't know what that meant exactly until I met Elias. But you stayed. I said I'd stay a month. He had no right to do it this way. No, he didn't. Gideon turned and looked at her directly. There was something unguarded in his face that she had not seen before. Not anger, but something rawer than that. And you're not angry. I didn't say that. I said, not at him. She let that sit for a moment. He's a man running out of time who loves his son and doesn't know how to fix what time did. He made a choice I wouldn't have made. But I understand why he made it. I've been made choices about before. I know the difference between someone doing it to serve themselves and someone doing it because they're afraid of what happens if they don't. I'm not leaving tonight, she said, and I'm not making any other decisions tonight either. Neither should you. She stood and picked up the lamp. Go talk to your father. Not to settle anything. Not to confront anything. Just go be in the same room with him. He's not going to have that many more evenings. She walked past him and down the hall to her room and closed the door. She stood in the dark for a moment before lighting her own lamp, and she heard, after a while, the sound of his boots moving not toward the back door, but toward the other end of the house, toward Elias's room, and the quiet knock, and the low sound of the old man's voice answering, and then the long murmur of 2 voices through the wall. Not the words, just the shape of them, the rise and fall of 2 people finally saying something in the same room at the same time. She lit her lamp and sat on the edge of the bed and held the small wooden box in her lap and listened to the sound of them talking, and understood that something had been broken open tonight that needed to be broken, and that breaking open was not the same as breaking. 3 days after Elias's confession, Cobb Reeve came back. He arrived in the late morning and found Wren in the yard splitting wood. Properly now, the grain read correctly most of the time. The split clean when she was paying attention and only slightly off when she was not. He watched her from the gate with the same frank attention he had brought to their first conversation, then came through and leaned against the fence post. I want to tell you something about Gideon, not because you've asked, because I think it's the kind of thing that's useful to know, and I think you're the kind of person who knows what to do with useful information." She waited. Before Clara died, Gideon Farrow was the kind of man who noticed what everyone around him was carrying. Their good days and their bad ones, what they'd mentioned in passing months ago. He remembered things. He came home for supper and he talked at supper, not because he was being social, not because he was performing anything, but because he was genuinely present in the room he was standing in. He had that quality. Cobb paused. After, he stepped back from all of it. From the noticing, the talking, the presence, like he decided he didn't have the right to take up that much space anymore. He looked at her. But here's the thing. The man I've been watching the past few weeks. He put a lamp on the teaching table. Did you know he used to help the Rennick girl with her reading years ago? He'd completely stopped. He started again. He straightened from the fence. "I'm not trying to tell you what to do with any of this. I just think you should know who you're actually looking at." He said goodbye the way he always did, directly, without ceremony, and rode back out the East Road. Wren stood in the yard with the axe and thought about the lamp placed before dawn, and the careful axe angle correction that had made all the difference. She picked up the axe and went back to work. The vulnerability exchange happened on a night when neither of them planned it, which was the only way it could have happened at all. Elias had been more tired than usual that day, sleeping through most of the afternoon and into the evening, and the house had taken on the particular quiet of a place organized around someone resting. Gideon had come in from the evening check earlier than usual, and after a quiet supper, he had sat on the back steps instead of going back out. Wren came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him without asking. He took the cup she offered without comment. They looked at the dark yard, the barn with its single lamp, the stars beginning to come through overhead, not the handful visible from narrower skies, but the full, improbable abundance of them, layer behind layer, depth behind depth, the sky so thick with light that the dark between was almost incidental. "She fell in the front room," he said. "Clara." The floor there. There was a board that had always caught her attention, a high edge that she'd been after me to fix for months. I kept saying I'd get to it. He turned the cup in his hands, the same gesture his father made. She noticed, something inherited, or simply the thing hands do when a person is working out how to say something difficult. I was in the south pasture when it happened. Somebody had to ride out to tell me. He stopped. The word somebody carried a particular weight, the weight of distance, of not having been there, of receiving the worst news of your life from a man on horseback in the middle of an ordinary afternoon when you were doing an ordinary thing and had no idea the world was about to be different. By the time I got back, he stopped again, cleared his throat. The board is still there. I fixed it the next morning. First thing I did when I got up. He looked at the stars. I've thought about that. Why, that was the first thing. Wren held her cup and did not say anything immediately. She understood that he was not looking for comfort, not looking for absolution, not even entirely looking for a response. He was saying the thing out loud for what might have been the first time. "Because you needed to do what you should have done before," she said finally, quietly. "Not to fix the board. To do the thing you'd been putting off." He turned and looked at her. "It doesn't make you responsible for what happened. The board and what happened. They're not the same thing. You know that. Knowing something and... He stopped. Yes, I know that. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of something that has been said finally being allowed to breathe, expanding into the space where it had been compressed. When I was 17, my mother's cousin arranged an introduction between me and a man she thought was suitable. I thought it was a coincidence. The party where we met, the circumstances of it, the apparent spontaneity of the whole thing. I built a great deal on that coincidence. 4 years of a life, largely. I found the letters between them eventually. Detailed, careful letters, every arranged encounter and stage-managed moment going back to the beginning. I don't tell that story as damage. I've been past the damage for a long time. I tell it because for a long while afterward, I couldn't trust anything that felt like it might be real. If something felt good, felt right, felt like it was happening naturally, my first response was to look for the mechanism, to find out who arranged it. Your father's letter. When I found out it wasn't from you, my first response was exactly that. Look for the mechanism. She looked at the stars. But the thing about Elias is that he didn't arrange what's happened since I got here. He arranged the beginning. Everything after that. She stopped. Everything after that has been what it actually is. Gideon was very still beside her. Not the careful, controlled stillness she had come to know, but a different kind. The stillness of someone listening with everything they have. I picked this, she said quietly. For the first time in a long time, I picked something. Nobody picked it for me. That's real. However it started. She heard him breathe. A different kind of breath than his usual ones. Slower, with more give in it. Your father wrote letters to Clara, Gideon said, not quite a question. I found them in the kitchen drawer. I didn't read them. I could tell from the outside what they were. He's been doing that for years. I found the first ones about 6 months after. I should have told him I found them. I didn't. He looked at the stars. We're very good in this family at knowing things, and not saying them. He's afraid you won't have a reason to stay, Gideon said. After. The word after was doing a great deal of work, containing in its 2 syllables an entire landscape of things that were not yet said and not yet happened. Wren held her cup and looked at the barn where the lamp burned steady in the dark. What do you think? She said. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, I think I stopped believing I had a right to want things. After Clara. A pause that had texture to it, the weight of 5 years of a decision made and then lived inside. I've been reconsidering that lately. That seems like a reasonable thing to reconsider, she said. They sat on the back steps for another half hour without speaking, and the stars moved their slow migration overhead, and the coffee went cold in their cups, and neither of them moved to go inside. 3 days later, Wren found herself alone with Elias in the late afternoon, reading to him from the book she had been working through with Petra and Lev. He liked the same passages they liked, the ones with action and consequence, the ones where the stakes were clear. She had been reading for perhaps an hour when he said, without opening his eyes, "Read me that part again, the part about the man who came back." She read it again. This time, when she stopped, his breathing had changed, and she thought he was asleep. She set the book on the side table. Then she noticed the drawer of his night table was open slightly, which was unusual. Elias was particular about such things. Inside, beneath a folded handkerchief, she could see the corner of a page covered in his handwriting. She should not have read it. She knew that even as she was reading it. But some things left within reach are left within reach on purpose, and she had begun to understand how Elias communicated. It was not addressed to anyone, or perhaps it was addressed to everyone, to his wife, long gone, and to Clara, gone more recently, and to Gideon, who was still here and still capable of hearing things if someone could find a way to say them, and perhaps even to himself. The younger version of himself who had believed that doing was enough. That presence was the same as saying that the people around him could feel what he felt without his having to put it into language. "I thought doing was enough," the letter said, in the unsteady handwriting of his recent months. "I thought she could see it in the work and the staying and the showing up. Maybe she could. But seeing it is not the same as hearing it, and I knew the difference. And I chose the easier thing. And I am old enough now to know that the easier thing is almost never the right thing, and young enough to grieve it. And that is an uncomfortable place to be. I have spent the end of my life writing to people who cannot answer. I thought this was penance. I think now it may be cowardice in a different costume. The person I need to say these things to is in the barn." Wren set the letter down carefully. She sat for a long time in the chair beside Elias's bed in the afternoon light, with the old man asleep and the words settling into her. Then she went to find him in the morning. He was in his chair by the window, more alert than he had been in days. The particular alertness of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to act on it. She sat across from him and said, without preamble, "I read what you were writing. I'm sorry. It was in reach and I—" He held up one hand, a small gesture of dismissal. "I know. I left it there." "You were doing it again," she said quietly. "Writing to people who aren't in the room. Trying to explain yourself to the ones who can't answer." "Yes." He looked at his hands for a while. The hands that had written all those letters, that had worked this land for 40 years, that had held his son as an infant, and then let go too early, and then held on too tight, and then let go again in all the wrong ways. "I know that." A long silence, the kind that has substance rather than absence. "But I'm running out of time to do it the other way." "Then do it the other way while you still can," Wren said. "He's in the barn." Something passed across Elias's face, the expression of a man who has been told something true and has no argument against it, and knows he has no argument against it, and is grateful for that rather than resentful of it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Send him in. Tell him I want to talk. Not cards, just talk." Wren left him looking at the morning light coming through the east window, and went to find Gideon, and sent him in, and stayed in the barn, and gave them the afternoon. Elias died on a morning that was quiet in the way of mornings that do not know yet what they are about to become. He had been slightly better the day before, not well, but more present, more himself, with the particular alertness of someone who has completed something and feels the completion. He had played cards with Gideon after supper. He had asked Wren to read to him, and she had sat in the chair beside his bed while the lamp made its warm circle, and Elias listened with his eyes closed. She had thought he was asleep when she stopped reading, but he said, without opening his eyes, "That girl Petra is going to be formidable." "Yes," Wren said, She already is. He smiled. She was glad she had seen that. In the morning, she came to bring his coffee, and he was in his chair by the window, which was where he always liked to be when he could manage it, facing east for the light. He looked as though he had simply stopped. All the mechanisms in the same position as before, the body arranged exactly as he would have arranged it himself, but the animating thing no longer present. His hands were in his lap. His face was at rest in a way she had not seen it at rest while he was living. Without the slight, effortful quality that had been there for weeks, the body working harder than it should at things that should be easy. At rest, he looked like the man he must have been before the cost of continuing had begun to show. She set the coffee cup on the table beside him. She stood for a moment looking at his face, at the stillness of it, at the eastward light coming through the window across his hands. Then she went to find Gideon. He was in the barn, as he always was at this hour. She stood in the barn doorway, and he looked up from what he was doing and read her face. She had 1 second of watching him read it, of seeing the recognition move through him. And he set down what he was holding and came toward her without asking, because asking was not necessary. She stepped aside. He went past her and into the house. She stood in the barn doorway and looked at the yard and the range beyond it and the sky above, which was the pale clear color of early morning, going bluer at the heights. The new foal was in the corral with its mother, still slightly uncertain on its legs, but more confident every day, learning the grammar of its own body. A bird was moving along the fence line, small and quick, purposeful. After a while, she went inside. Gideon was sitting in the chair across from his father's, the two chairs facing each other as they had when Elias was alive and using both of them. And he was not crying, and he was not speaking, and he was not doing anything at all except being in the room, which was the right thing. She came and stood in the doorway, not entering, not retreating, simply being present on the threshold. And when he looked up and found her there, she held his gaze across the room, and whatever passed between them did not require language and did not get any. After a while, he nodded once, barely perceptibly, and she came inside and closed the door softly behind her. The lamp that Elias had kept burning through the night was still lit, casting its amber light over the two chairs and the quilt on the floor and the old man's hands in his lap, and the light made everything in the room look both smaller and more significant than it usually did, the way all things look in the presence of something irreversible. Wren sat down on the footstool near the window and did not speak and did not move and did not do anything except stay, which was the only thing that was wanted and the only thing she had to give, and it turned out to be enough. The days after Elias died had a particular texture to them, different from ordinary days in the way that days following an irreversible thing are always different, not worse necessarily, but altered in their light and weight, as though the loss has changed the angle at which everything sits. Gideon worked. This was not a surprise. He worked the way he always worked, with the same economy of motion and the same early starts and the same careful attention to the ranch's 10,000 small requirements, except that now there was something hollowed out behind it. A quality of a man doing the right things in the right order because the order is familiar and the familiarity is the only reliable thing left. He ate what was put in front of him. He answered when spoken to. He was present in every technical sense, but he had stepped back. Wren could feel it the way you feel a drop in temperature. Not dramatically, not all at once, but persistently, a withdrawal so gradual and so practiced that she suspected he did not entirely know he was doing it. The lamp on the teaching table was still lit in the mornings. That was the thing she held on to. He had not stopped that. She did not press him. She kept her own rhythm. The children in the mornings, the garden in the afternoons, the 100 small things that hold a household functional. Petra had begun bringing a third child to the lessons, a grave-faced boy named Hatch from a family 2 miles further east, and the kitchen table had become a small and serious schoolroom that Wren had not designed and was pleased by. She told herself this was enough. She told herself grief takes its own shape in every person. She told herself this several times a day, which meant she did not entirely believe it. The document arrived on a morning when the weather had turned, the sky low and gray with the intention of rain before evening. Duff brought it in from the road, a sealed envelope delivered by a man on horseback who had not stayed, and set it on the kitchen table with the careful neutrality of someone who does not know what a thing is, but can tell it is significant. Gideon read it at the table. He read it twice. His face gave nothing away, which was its own kind of information. He folded it and set it down and looked at the window for a moment. Then he looked at Wren. It's from the lawyer who handled my father's affairs. His final wishes. There's a portion that concerns you. She waited. He left you a sum of money. Not large, but enough. He wrote that it was so you would have a choice. His words exactly. So you could choose freely. No conditions attached. Nothing required in exchange. He was very specific about that. That's very like him, she said. Yes. Gideon stood and went to the window. He stood with his back to her, looking at the gray sky over the range. You should know that I'll arrange whatever you need, if you want to go back, or go somewhere else. The wagon, a letter, whatever would be useful. He stopped. His shoulders had the held quality again, the bracing against something. You came here under false circumstances. Whatever you've done here, the work, the time, you don't owe us anything further. Wren sat very still with her hands flat on the table and looked at the back of him, at the set of his shoulders, at the particular quality of a man releasing someone before they can choose to leave. Because releasing them is less terrifying than waiting to find out what they choose. Gideon, she said. He did not turn. Look at me. A pause. Then he turned, and his face had the closed quality she had not seen since the first weeks. The carefully managed surface of a man who has decided that not showing things is the safest available position. Is that what you want? She said. Or is that what you've practiced saying so long you've forgotten there's a difference? The room was very quiet. Rain had begun on the roof, not heavy, just persistent, the sound of something that intends to stay. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without flinching, without offering exits. He did not answer, which was, as she had come to know with him, the same as an answer. I'm going to check on the garden before the rain gets worse. Supper will be at the usual time. She went out, and she did not slam the door, and she kept her face composed until she was in the kitchen garden with the first real rain coming down cold and even on her shoulders. And then she stood in it for a moment with her eyes closed and allowed herself to feel the full complicated weight of being a person who has decided something they cannot yet say out loud. Cobb Reeve came the following afternoon. He sat in the chair on the porch that had been Elias's. She thought he probably didn't know that, and she didn't tell him. I want to say something plainly, he said. She waited. I like you. I think you've done something real here, and I think Elias was right about you, which is a thing I wouldn't have said about one of Elias's ideas before now. A pause. I've thought about whether there was a version of this where I said something different. There isn't. I know what's happened here, and what I know about Gideon Pharaoh is that he won't ask you to stay, even if he wants you to, even if it's the thing he wants more than anything he's allowed himself to want in 5 years. He will not ask because he doesn't believe he has the right. So I'm asking you, not for me, not for him, just asking. What do you want? Not what Elias planned. Not what this place needs. Not the practical thing. A pause. What do you actually want? The rain from the day before had left everything clean and sharp-edged, the air carrying the cold mineral smell of wet earth. Somewhere on the range, a hawk was turning slow circles in the pale sky, unhurried, reading the land below with its particular patience. Wren looked at the hawk for a moment. Then she looked at her hands. I need to think about that, she said. Cobb nodded. That's the right answer. The wrong answer would have been faster. He rode out the east road, and she watched him go, and then sat with her mending untouched in her lap, thinking about what it meant that she had needed to think about it, and what it meant that the thinking was not as difficult as she had expected. On the morning after Cobb's visit, Wren woke before the lamp was lit on the teaching table and lay in the pre-dawn quiet and thought about Gideon saying, I was here, right here, and about 5 years of a man staying away from a portion of his own land, and she got up and dressed and walked out into the early morning while the ranch was still quiet. The south pasture was past the third fence line through a gate that had been well maintained in the sense that it opened smoothly, which meant someone came through here regularly enough to keep it functional even if they never went further. The grass was longer than in the grazed areas, thicker, gone somewhat wild at the edges where the fence posts stood, not abandoned, maintained at a distance, kept intact, but not entered. She walked slowly to the northwest corner, reading the landscape the way she had learned to read the kitchen garden. What was growing? What was struggling? What had been left alone long enough to become itself? She found the section of fallen fence line without looking for it. 4 posts down, the wire lying in the grass where it had been long enough that the grass had grown partially through it. She knelt in the wet grass and looked at it for a while. Then she began to work, clearing the grass from around the wire, separating it from what had grown through it, laying it out along the posts that still stood, so that someone with tools could see what needed doing and do it efficiently. She could make the work easier for whoever came after. She did not think of it as a statement. She thought of it as a thing that needed doing, and she was here, and she could do some of it. She was halfway through when she heard the gate. She did not turn around. She heard his boots in the long grass, the particular rhythm of them, and kept working. He stopped a few feet away. She could feel him looking at the fence, at her hands, at the line she had cleared. He said nothing for a long time. She fell in the front room, he said finally, and his voice was different than it had been when he'd said those words before, less controlled, something closer to the surface of things. But I've been punishing this pasture for it, and myself. I know that's not. I know the logic of it doesn't hold. Grief isn't logical. It just goes where it goes. He came and crouched down beside her in the grass, not to help with the fence, just to be at the same level. She felt him there without looking at him. I was here, right here, working, and she was. By the time someone rode out and I got back, it was done. All of it. Over. I've thought about every version of it. Every way I could have been there. None of the versions change what happened. I know that. But you've been living in them anyway. Yes, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was looking at the far tree line, the sky going gold now above the east horizon. Your father wrote to her for 5 years, trying to explain himself to someone who couldn't answer. You've been standing in this pasture in your mind for 5 years doing the same thing. She held his gaze when he turned to look at her. You're not going to find what you're looking for there. She's not there. The answer isn't there. Something moved in his face. Not the surface management, but the thing beneath it. The actual thing. I don't know how to stop, he said. It came out plainly, without drama, and the plainness made it the most honest thing she had heard from him. I've been doing it long enough that I don't know what stopping looks like. Your father saw it. He saw you in there. He just didn't know how to reach you from the outside, so he tried to send someone in. It was a foolish way to do it, and he knew that. And he did it anyway because he was running out of time and he loved you. The board on the floor. You fixed it the next morning because you needed to do what you hadn't done before. I think you've been doing that ever since. Fixing things that needed doing before. Trying to make up the account. But the account isn't the thing that needs tending. He sat down fully in the grass, not falling, choosing it, the way a man sits down when he has decided to stop holding himself up by force of will alone. He sat and looked at the far tree line, and she sat beside him in the long wet grass of the south pasture, and looked at it with him, and the sun came up over the eastern hills in a slow spill of gold that moved across the grass like something being given back. Neither of them spoke for a long time. When they went back through the gate, Gideon latched it carefully and stood looking at the post for a moment. Then he said, without quite looking at her, I'll bring tools out tomorrow and finish that fence. It was not about the fence. They both knew it was not about the fence. I'll come with you, Wren said. He nodded once, and they walked back to the ranch in the early morning, with the wet grass bending under their boots, and the birds going full-throated now in every direction. That evening, Hatch appeared at the kitchen door with a covered dish. The Grundy boy, grave-faced and purposeful, holding it out with the solemn care of a child entrusted with something important. My mother made it. She said you'd been working hard. Wren took the dish and looked at the boy's serious face and felt something move through her. The accumulation of small things, the lamp on the table, the dish at the door, Cobb's honest question, Gideon sitting down in the wet grass. All of it adding up to something she had not had a word for until recently. Thank you, Hatch. Tell your mother. Thank you. He nodded with great seriousness and went back down the road. Gideon came in from the barn and stopped when he saw her in the doorway with the dish. He took it from her hands and set it on the counter and looked at it for a moment with an expression that contained, she thought, the first faint outline of something that was not grief and was not guilt and was not the practiced endurance of the past 5 years. She went to set the table, and he went to pour the coffee. and neither of them remarked on any of it. He came to her late that night, after she had gone to her room, and knocked at the door quietly. She opened it, and he stood in the hallway with the box in his hands, the small wooden box Elias had given her, which she kept on the table by the window. In the low lamp light from the hallway, his face was without the usual management entirely, the surface and the thing beneath it both present and neither hiding the other. "He gave you this," he said. "Yes. I know what's in it. I know what he was thinking when he did." He turned the box in his hands once, slowly. "I'm not asking you to do anything about what's in it. I'm not asking you anything that has to do with him, or the money, or any of what was arranged." He met her eyes directly, with the full, unguarded directness she had seen only in pieces before, and was seeing now whole. "I'm asking if you want to stay." The hallway was quiet. Somewhere in the house something settled, wood cooling in the night. "Not because of him," Gideon said. "Not because of what he planned or what this place needs or what makes sense." A pause that cost him something. "Because of me. Because I'm asking you." That's the first time I've said that to anyone. In a long time. Maybe ever. "I'll tell you tomorrow," she said. "Let me tell you tomorrow." He looked at her for a moment. He nodded once. He handed her the box gently, the way you hand someone something that belongs to them, and went back down the hall, and she heard the quiet close of his door. She stood in her room with the box in her hands and looked at the window and the dark of the range beyond it, and the stars above, more than you could count, more than you could hold in a single looking, and she held the box and thought about the morning and what she was going to say in it. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, the thinking was easy. She woke before the lamp was lit on the teaching table. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that she lay still for a while instead of rising immediately, and looked at the ceiling of the small room that had been Gideon's when he was a boy, and thought about nothing complicated at all. The answer she had arrived at in the dark hours was the same in the morning light, which was how she knew it was real. Real things do not change between night and day. Only the things a person is not sure about shift with the light, revealing themselves as dependent on the particular quality of darkness that allowed them to seem more certain than they were. She dressed and took the small wooden box from the table by the window and put on her coat and went out. The morning was cold and clear, the sky overhead still holding the last of the night's deep color at its highest point, going paler and more luminous toward the east where the sun was gathering itself for the day's work. The grass was silver with dew. Her boots left dark tracks across it as she walked, not toward the barn, not toward the kitchen garden, but south, through the first fence line and the second, and through the gate that opened smoothly because someone kept it that way, into the south pasture. She walked to the northwest corner where the fallen fence line lay. Someone had been back after them. She could see the fresh marks in the soil, the posts checked and restabilized. The work she had started continued further along the line. He had come back with tools, as he said he would. Not everything was repaired yet, but the intention was clear in the evidence, unmistakable as any declaration. And the intention was the thing. She stood in the long grass for a moment and looked at the place where she and Gideon had sat the morning before. The flattened area where the dew had been pressed from the grass and had not yet fully recovered, still holding the shape of two people sitting close in the early light, looking at the same tree line. She opened the box. The ring lay on its folded cloth, plain gold, worn smooth at the inner surface from years of being worn by someone who had worked with her hands. Not smooth from carelessness, but from use, from the honest daily contact of a life being lived. Wren looked at it for a long moment. She thought about Clara, who she had never known and knew only in outline. A woman who had worn this ring through years of hard work and hard weather, who had fallen on a morning when the person who loved her most was half a mile away in this exact ground. She thought about what it means to love someone and lose them, and carry the weight of the losing for 5 years without finding a place to set it down. She thought about Elias, who had written letters to the same silence for years, trying to explain himself, trying to correct through language what had not been corrected in time. She thought about how grief makes people do the same things over and over in the dark, looking for the resolution that does not exist in the place they are looking. She thought about what it had cost him to realize this, and what it had cost him to change. She thought about the fact that he had, in fact, changed, had sent someone in rather than sending another letter, had tried the other way at the very end, even though the other way was harder. He had tried. She took the ring from its cloth and held it in her palm. Then she knelt in the wet grass of the south pasture and pressed it gently into the earth at the base of the nearest fence post. The one that had been repaired, the one that would hold now, the one that had been given back its purpose, not buried, just placed, set down in the ground of the place that had needed tending, and was being tended, where the work of coming back was already visibly underway. She stood and closed the empty box and looked at the fence line in the early morning light for a moment. Then she walked back to the ranch. Cobb Reeve was at the gate when she came through. He was early, and he was not the kind of man who arrived early without reason. He had his horse at the post and his hat in his hands, and the direct expression of someone who has decided what they came to do, and is proceeding with it without hesitation or performance. She stopped a few feet away. I thought about what you said yesterday, that you needed to think. I'm not here to influence that. I want you to know that's not why I came. Why did you come? He looked at her with the honest attention she had always appreciated in him, the quality of a man who does not dress things in more or less than they are. To ask one more time, because I think you deserve to be asked. Whatever you decide, whether you stay or go, whether it's here or somewhere else entirely, I hope it's what you actually want, not what makes sense, not what fits the situation neatly. He paused. You're the kind of person who takes care of things. I want someone to take care of you. If that's not me, then I hope it's whoever it is. He said it without self-pity and without performance, and it landed with the full weight of something simply and genuinely meant. The particular weight of a true thing said by a person who does not need anything from the saying of it. Thank you, Cobb. That's the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a long time. He nodded once. He put his hat back on. I figured, he said, and the faint smile in it was real and a little rueful and entirely without bitterness. The smile of a man who knew how things were before he came and is not surprised by how they remain and has made his peace with it. He untied his horse and swung up. You're going to be all right, Wren Aldgate. Yes, I think I am. He rode out the east road and she watched him go, and when he had disappeared around the line of trees, she turned and walked back toward the house. Gideon was at the mended section of the porch roof, which had needed new boards on the east end since before Wren arrived. She had noticed it her first week. The kind of thing that will hold for another season, but not two. The kind of thing that someone who is paying attention to the future addresses before it becomes urgent. He had a hammer and a board and the focused concentration of a man doing a task that requires his full attention and is, for that reason, grateful for the task. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at him for a moment. He had not heard her come across the yard. He was fitting the board to the edge with care, reading the angle of it, adjusting by small degrees until the placement was right before committing to the nail. The same care he brought to everything, the same patience, the same willingness to get it right rather than just get it done. She had been turning a particular thought over for days, wearing it smooth the way water wears stone. Not the words of it, because she had known the words for some time, but the evidence of it, which she was looking at right now. The careful placement of the board, the reading of the grain, the unhurried intention of a man who had decided he was going to be here when the work was finished, and for a long while after. "Gideon," she said. He looked down. He had been waiting, she realized. In his way, without making it visible, he had been waiting all morning for this moment, and the waiting had had a quality to it that she recognized because she knew now what his patience looked like from the outside. She held up the empty box. He looked at it, and then at her, and then came down from the porch roof in the unhurried way of a man who has learned that hurrying toward things does not make them arrive differently, just faster, and stood on the top step so that they were closer to eye level. "I went to the south pasture," she said. He looked at the box in her hand. He looked at her face. He waited. "I'm not replacing her," Wren said. She said it plainly, in the way she had learned from Elias, the way of someone who has decided that plain truth is the most respectful thing available, that dressing it up serves no one. "I'm not filling anything that's empty. I'm not here to fix what happened in this pasture or what happened in that front room, because those things aren't mine to fix and they don't need fixing. They need to be carried differently by someone who's been carrying them the wrong way for long enough." She held his gaze steadily, without wavering, without softening what she was saying. "I'm just here, if that's enough." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. The morning had come fully now, the sun above the east hills, and the light clean and angled across the yard, the grass already losing its silver as the dew burned off. A bird was moving along the fence line in the quick, purposeful way of small things, with a great deal to do and no time to waste doing it. "It's more than enough," he said. He said it quietly, without ornamentation, in the plain, direct way that she had come to understand was how he said things that mattered. Simply, with no more and no less than was true. Because simplicity was the only container large enough to hold something of that weight without spilling it. She wrote to the lawyer that afternoon. The letter was brief and clear. No excess, no flourish, the meaning visible on the first reading. She declined the sum Elias had left her. She wanted it on record, in writing, that she was staying because she was staying, and not because of anything that had been arranged or inherited or offered as incentive. She wanted the record to say, she chose this, on her own terms, without owing anything to anyone for the choosing. "You didn't have to do that," he said when he read the letter before she sealed it. "I know. That's why I did it." He looked at her for the same extended moment he had given her on the porch steps. The full and uncomplicated looking of a man who has stopped trying to protect himself from seeing things clearly. Then he went back to the porch roof, and she heard the steady sound of the hammer in the afternoon, even and unhurried, the sound of work being done because it needed doing, and the person doing it intended to be here when it was finished, and for a good while after. The children came the next morning, all three of them, Petra and Lev and grave-faced Hatch, and settled at the kitchen table with the serious readiness of students who have decided that learning is important and attendance is not optional. Wren put the books out and sat with them, and they worked through the morning with the particular combination of effort and delight that is the best possible way to learn anything. Petra quick and impatient and needing to be slowed down sometimes to let understanding catch up with speed. Lev careful and thorough and needing to be reassured that careful and thorough was its own kind of quick, Hatch grave and deliberate, and gradually, over the weeks, beginning to smile at things he found interesting instead of maintaining the solemn expression he had apparently decided was appropriate to the seriousness of learning. Partway through, she became aware that Gideon had come in from the yard and was standing in the kitchen doorway. She did not look up. She could feel him there, the particular quality of his attention, which she had learned to read the way she had learned to read the grain of wood before the axe came down, by the texture of it, the density, what it told you about what was underneath. He stayed for a while. Then she heard him move on, back through the house and out the front. The sound of his boots on the new porch boards, solid and even, the sound of boards that had been put in properly and would hold. Later, after the children had gone, after supper, after the day had done all its ordinary work and arrived at its end, she was sitting on the back steps in the cooling air when he came out and sat beside her. Close, the way he had sat on the night they had talked until the coffee went cold. Close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him against the evening chill without either of them having arranged it. They sat and looked at the range in the fading light, at the long grass going amber and rose in the last of the sun, at the south pasture beyond the fence lines, green and still, the repaired section visible from here if you knew where to look and what you were seeing. After a while, Hatch appeared at the gate, the Grundy boy, who had apparently decided the ranch was a place he had visiting rights to now, and who came and went with the quiet purposefulness of someone who has figured out where he belongs and acts accordingly. He looked at them both sitting on the steps with the same grave assessment he brought to most things, working out what he was seeing. "Is he your husband?" Hatch asked Wren, with the absolute directness of a child who has not yet learned that some questions are considered impolite to ask directly, and whose directness is consequently more useful than the alternative. Wren looked at Gideon beside her. He looked back at her with the quiet and open expression she had come to know as his true face, the one that existed when he was not managing anything, when the management had been set aside because it was no longer necessary, the face of the man Cobb had described, the one who had been there all along, underneath the years of careful distance. "He's my choice," Wren said. "That's better." Hatch considered this with the great seriousness he brought to most things, weighing it, looking for the flaw in it. He apparently found none, because he nodded once in the manner of someone who has examined a proposition and found it sound, and went back down the road the way he came, small and purposeful and entirely satisfied. "Is it?" he said, quietly, not challenging, genuinely asking, the question of a man who has been surprised by something and wants to make sure he is understanding it correctly. She looked at him, at the gray eyes that were not so stone-hard as they had seemed on the first afternoon, that had in them now a quality of openness she had only seen in glimpses before, and was now seeing steadily, as though what had always been there had finally found room to exist on the surface. At the face that had been lived in by a great deal of weather, not just the weather of the range, but the interior kind, the weather that does its work quietly and over time, and leaves its marks in the lines around the eyes and the set of the mouth. And that had room in it now for something other than grief, other than the careful management of grief, something she could not quite name, but recognized. She thought about all the choices she had made in her life, the ones that had been made for her, dressed up as coincidence, the ones she had believed were hers, and later understood were not. And then the one she had made on a wagon, reading an old man's unsteady handwriting, thinking, "This one is mine. This one, whatever it leads to, is something I chose with my own eyes open." "Yes," she said, "it is." The sun went down behind the western hills in the slow, unhurried way it always did out here, as though it had no reason to rush, as though this particular ending was worth watching properly, the light thickening and warming and then going, the colors coming into the grass that only appear in the minutes between day and dark. The south pasture caught the last of the light and held it for a moment, green going gold, going the color of old honey, the repaired fence line casting its long shadow east across the land that had been avoided and was avoided no longer. The ticking of the stove came through the kitchen window. The foal made its small, certain sound from the barn, less uncertain than it had been, more itself every day, learning steadily what it was. The lamp in the kitchen was already burning, lit by no one in particular, simply part of how the evening was arranged now, part of the ordinary order of a house that had come back to itself. Gideon's hand covered hers on the step, rough-palmed and warm and certain, the hands of a man who has spent his life working and whose hands carry all of it, all the years and all the weather and all the fixing of things, and who now uses them to hold something he has chosen to hold and has no intention of releasing. The ranch was quiet. The stars were coming through one by one, then several at once, then all of them, the full abundance of them, layer behind layer, more than you could count, and more than you needed to count. Out in the south pasture, at the base of a fence post that had been repaired and would hold, a plain gold ring sat in the earth, not buried, just placed, set down in the right place by the right hands at the right time. The lamp in the kitchen window burned steady. The foal moved in the corral, more confident every day. They stayed.